The arrow came from the dark tree line, and it was not meant for Elena. She saw it too late to move away, and too early to stop herself from stepping in front of the man beside her. The impact threw her back against the stone wall of the training yard, and the world turned into a single sharp point of pain in her side. Voices shouted around her. Someone screamed her name. She could not tell whose voice it was. Blood soaked through her healer's coat before she even hit the ground. The night sky spun above her, black and endless, and somewhere far away she heard boots running across gravel, fast and heavy, the sound of an entire pack breaking into panic at once. Elena Voss had spent 3 years mixing herbs and wrapping wounds for other people. She had never imagined her own blood would be the one soaking into the ground of Ashvale territory. The last thing she remembered before the darkness took her was a pair of eyes she had only ever seen from a distance, gold and sharp, looking down at her like the rest of the world had stopped existing. When she woke again, the pain had not lessened. If anything, it had grown teeth. Her whole body burned, as though the wound in her side was spreading heat through her veins instead of blood. She tried to speak, and only managed a broken sound. A woman's voice, calm and clipped, was speaking somewhere close by. "The bleeding won't stop. I've packed it 3 times already." "Then pack it again," a second voice answered. This one was deeper, quieter, and carried an authority that made even the air in the room feel heavier. "And bring me every healer trained in poison wounds. All of them. Now." Elena forced her eyes open. The room swam into focus slowly. A healing chamber she recognized, but had never lain in as the patient. Wooden beams overhead, shelves of jars along the far wall, the same jars she had organized herself more times than she could count. And beside her cot, close enough that she could feel the warmth from him, sat a man she had only ever addressed by title. Alpha King Damaris Thorne did not look like a man watching a healer's assistant recover from an ordinary wound. He looked like a man standing over something he could not afford to lose. "You're awake," he said, and his voice, though quiet, seemed to fill the entire room. Elena tried to answer him, but her throat had closed around the words. She managed only a whisper, and even that cost her more strength than she had. "Don't talk," he said. "Just breathe." She had never heard him speak so gently to anyone. The pack whispered about him constantly, about his coldness, his distance, the way he ruled with silence instead of warmth. He was not supposed to sit at the bedside of an assistant healer who mixed tonics in the back room and had never spoken to him directly in her life. And yet here he was. 3 healers arrived within minutes, older and more experienced than Elena, each of them trained for exactly this kind of wound. They examined her side, murmured to one another in low, worried tones, and began preparing salves and bindings with practiced hands. Damaris watched them work for exactly as long as it took him to see that none of it was helping. The wound refused to close. Fresh blood kept rising to the surface no matter how tightly they wrapped it, as though her body was rejecting every attempt to heal it. "This isn't a normal wound," one of the healers finally admitted. "I don't understand why it won't seal." "Then find someone who does," Damaris said. "My king, we are the most experienced healers in the territory. If we cannot, then you are dismissed," he said, standing so suddenly that the healer flinched. "All of you, leave." The chamber went silent, except for Elena's ragged breathing. The healers exchanged uncertain looks, clearly unwilling to argue with an Alpha King, but equally unwilling to leave a patient in this condition without care. "My king, someone should stay to monitor." "I will monitor her." His voice left no room for argument. "Leave the supplies. I know how to use them." One by one, the healers filed out of the room, casting glances back at their unconscious patient and the king who had just claimed her care as his own personal task. The door closed behind the last of them, and silence settled over the chamber like a blanket. Elena drifted in and out of awareness after that. She caught fragments of sound and light, a cool cloth pressed to her forehead, the rustle of fabric as someone shifted beside her, the low murmur of a voice she could not quite place words to. Time lost its shape entirely. She could not have said whether an hour had passed or a full day. At some point, deep in the haze of fever, she dreamed of a forest she did not recognize. Tall trees with silver bark, a stream running clear over smooth stones, and a boy's voice calling out a name that was not her own. The name felt familiar in a way that made no sense, warm and aching at the same time, like something she had lost long before she was old enough to remember losing it. She dreamed of running through that forest, small hands reaching for someone taller than her, someone who scooped her up and laughed and called her by that same unfamiliar name. And then, without warning, the dream shifted. The forest darkened, the laughter turned to shouting. She was being carried, fast, through trees that blurred into streaks of black and silver, someone's heartbeat pounding against her ear, someone's voice telling her to stay quiet, just stay quiet. Everything would be fine if she just stayed quiet. She woke with that name still caught in her throat, and before she could stop herself, before she even understood what she was doing, she whispered it out loud into the darkness of the healing chamber. The name was not her own. Beside her, the man sitting in the chair went completely still. Elena felt it before she saw it, a stillness so absolute it seemed to change the temperature of the room. She opened her eyes, vision blurred with fever, and found Damaris staring down at her with an expression she had never seen on him before. Not distance, not coldness. Something raw and unguarded, something that looked almost like fear. "Where did you hear that name?" His voice had lost all of its usual command. It came out low and unsteady, barely more than a breath. Elena tried to answer, but the fever pulled her back under before she could form the words. The last thing she registered was his hand closing gently around hers, as though he was afraid that if he let go, she would slip away entirely. The hours that followed blurred together in a haze of heat and cold and half-formed dreams. Elena's fever rose and fell like a tide, each wave leaving her weaker than the last. She was aware, in fragments, of the healers returning to check on her and being turned away again. She was aware of the sound of Damaris's voice, low and constant, speaking to her even when she could not answer, as though the sound of his voice alone might be enough to keep her tethered to the world. At one point she surfaced enough to hear him say something that made no sense to her feverish mind. "You are not allowed to leave me twice," he said, so quietly she almost thought she had imagined it. "Not after everything it cost to keep you safe the first time." She wanted to ask him what he meant. She wanted to ask him why a king who had never once looked her way in 3 years of service was now sitting beside her cot, as though the fate of his entire kingdom depended on whether she opened her eyes again. But the words would not come, and the darkness pulled her back down before she could try. Outside the healing chamber, word of the Alpha King's behavior spread through Ashvale territory like fire through dry grass. No one could remember a time when Damaris Thorne had shown this kind of attention to anyone, let alone an assistant healer with no rank, no family name of any importance, and no claim on his time. The Pack Council, uneasy at the sudden absence of their king from every meeting and every duty, began to ask quiet questions that no one dared ask him directly. Why would the Alpha King dismiss 3 of the territory's most skilled healers? Why would he sit beside a stranger's bed for hours without rest? And why, when one of the younger healers finally worked up the courage to ask him directly, did he answer with only a single sentence that explained nothing and silenced every further question at once? "She is not a stranger," he said. "She is the reason I have done everything I have done for the last 12 years. No one understood what that meant. Not yet. Elena did not understand it either. Not when she was drifting through fever dreams of a forest she had never visited and a name that was not hers, and not in the moment 3 days later when she finally opened her eyes and found the world steady around her for the first time since the arrow had struck. The pain in her side had dulled to a manageable ache. The fever had broken sometime in the night, leaving her drenched and exhausted but alive. She turned her head slowly and found Damaris still sitting beside her, though he looked as though the last 3 days had worn him down more than they had worn her. "You're awake," he said again, the same 2 words he had spoken the first time, though his voice cracked slightly on the second word this time. "How long?" Elena managed, her throat raw and dry. "Was I asleep?" "3 days." He reached for a cup of water on the table beside the cot and helped her drink, his hand steady even though something in his eyes was not. "You gave every healer in this territory a reason to doubt themselves." "I'm sorry," she said, though she did not fully understand what she was apologizing for. "Don't be." He set the cup down carefully, as though it required all of his concentration. "You have nothing to apologize for, nothing at all." Elena studied him in the pale morning light coming through the chamber window, trying to reconcile the cold and distant king the entire pack whispered about with the man who had refused to leave her side for 3 days and nights. Nothing about this made sense to her. She had spoken perhaps a dozen words to Damaris Thorne in the entire time she had lived in Ashvale territory, and none of them had been personal. "Why did you stay?" she asked quietly. "Why did you send the healers away?" Something flickered across his face, quick and complicated, gone before she could fully read it. He looked at her for a long moment, as though weighing how much of the truth she was ready to hear. "Because I have been waiting 12 years to find out if you were still alive," he said finally. "And I was not going to let anyone but myself make sure you stayed that way." Elena stared at him, certain she had misheard him through the last traces of her fever, but his expression did not change, did not soften into the kind of joke that might have explained away his words. He meant exactly what he said, every syllable of it, and the weight of that meaning settled over her like something she was not yet ready to carry. Before she could ask him what he meant, footsteps sounded in the corridor outside, quick and urgent, followed by a sharp knock on the chamber door. Damaris rose immediately, his entire posture shifting back into the guarded authority Elena recognized from a distance, though he kept one hand resting protectively on the edge of her cot, even as he called out for whoever stood outside to enter. The door opened, and a young guard stepped inside, breathless from running. "My king." Riders were spotted at the northern border, Cassian Vale's colors. Damaris's jaw tightened. Whatever softness had lived in his expression a moment before vanished entirely, replaced by something sharp and dangerous. "How many?" he asked. "A scouting party, small, but they were watching the territory line for over an hour before they retreated." Elena did not know the name Cassian Vale, but she understood enough from the guard's tone and the sudden tension in the room to know it meant nothing good. Damaris looked back at her, and for just a moment, the fear she had seen in his eyes when she whispered that unfamiliar name in her fever returned, sharper now, mixed with something that looked almost like dread. "Rest," he told her, his voice gentler than it had been with the guard but no less urgent. "Whatever is happening outside these walls, you are not going anywhere until I understand what it means that you spoke that name in your sleep." He left the room a moment later, and Elena lay alone in the healing chamber for the first time in 3 days, staring at the ceiling, trying to make sense of a life that had somehow tilted sideways in the space of a single arrow, a single fever, and a single word she did not remember choosing to say. Whatever the truth was, she understood one thing clearly as the door closed behind him. Her life would never go back to what it had been before that night. 3 days after the scouting party was spotted at the northern border, Elena was strong enough to sit up without her head spinning, though she was still forbidden from leaving the healing chamber. The order had come directly from Damaris, delivered through a guard named Colin, who seemed both terrified of his king and strangely protective of Elena at the same time. "He said if you try to walk out of here before he says so, I'm to carry you back myself," Colin told her, looking deeply uncomfortable at the idea of doing any such thing to a woman he barely knew. "He can't keep me locked in a healing chamber forever," Elena said, though she suspected, based on everything she had witnessed in the last week, that Damaris Thorne could do exactly that if he decided to. Colin only shrugged and busied himself checking the water jug on her table, clearly hoping the conversation would end there. It was Nora, one of the senior healers who had originally treated Elena's wound, who finally gave her something close to real information. Nora had been allowed back into the chamber once the fever broke, though she moved around Elena now with a kind of careful curiosity, as though studying a puzzle she had not been given all the pieces to solve. "Do you remember anything?" Nora asked one afternoon, changing the bandage at Elena's side with practiced hands, "from before you came to Ashvale? Anything at all about your childhood?" Elena considered the question carefully. She had been raised in the lower quarter of the territory by a distant relative who had never spoken warmly of her past, and her memories before the age of 6 or 7 were little more than fog and impressions. A forest, a stream, a voice calling her a name that was not Elena. "Not much," she admitted. "Why?" Nora hesitated, glancing toward the door as though checking that no one else could hear. "Because the king has spent the last 3 days going through old pack records. Records that were sealed 12 years ago. No one is supposed to have access to them except the Alpha King himself, and even then, only in cases the council considers matters of the highest importance." "What kind of records?" "I don't know exactly," Nora admitted, "but one of the archive clerks mentioned he was searching for anything connected to a healer named Mira Voss." The name meant nothing to Elena at first, and then, slowly, it meant everything. Voss was her own family name, though she had always assumed it belonged to the relative who raised her, a woman named Greta who had never once mentioned any other family connected to that name. "Voss is my name," Elena said slowly. Nora's hand stilled over the bandage. "I know," she said quietly. "That's exactly why I'm telling you this." Before Elena could ask anything further, the chamber door opened, and Damaris entered without knocking, his expression unreadable, a thin leather folder tucked beneath one arm. Nora rose immediately, offered a quick bow, and excused herself from the room with the practiced efficiency of someone who understood exactly when her presence was no longer wanted. Damaris waited until the door closed behind her before he spoke. "How are you feeling?" "Better," Elena said. "Strong enough to hear whatever it is you've been avoiding telling me." Something like a tired smile crossed his face, though it did not fully reach his eyes. He pulled the chair beside her cot closer and sat down, setting the leather folder on his lap without opening it. 12 years ago," he said, "there was a healer in this territory named Mira Voss. She was skilled beyond anyone I had ever known, gifted in ways that went beyond ordinary training. She could sense things in a wound, in a fever, in a poison, that no other healer could detect." Elena felt something tighten in her chest, though she could not have said why a name she had never heard before was making her pulse quicken like this. "I knew her," Damaris continued, his voice quieter now, more careful. "Before I became king, before any of the responsibilities I carry now, I knew her as someone I trusted more than almost anyone else in this territory." "What happened to her?" Damaris was silent for a long moment, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on some point in the past that Elena could not see. "She died protecting someone from an enemy who wanted that person gone before they could grow old enough to become a threat." "Protecting who?" He looked at her then, directly, and something in his expression made the question feel unnecessary even before he answered it. "Her daughter," he said. "A little girl who should have inherited everything her mother was, everything she could have become in this territory, if the people hunting them had ever caught up to her." Elena's mouth had gone dry. "What was the daughter's name?" Damaris opened the leather folder slowly, revealing a single aged document, the ink faded but still legible, a birth record from 12 years ago bearing a name Elena recognized instantly, the same name that had risen unbidden from her fever dreams and slipped out of her mouth before she understood what she was saying. The name was written clearly at the top of the page. Beneath it, listed as the mother, was the name Mira Voss, and beside that, in a different hand, someone had written a single line that made the entire room feel unsteady beneath Elena's feet. "Renamed and placed under protective custody by order of the Crown. New identity, Elena Voss, ward of Greta Ashby, lower quarter, Ashvale territory." "That's me," Elena whispered. "Yes," Damaris said quietly. "It's you." The silence that followed stretched long enough that Elena could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. Everything she had believed about her own history, everything Greta had ever told her about being an orphan with no family worth mentioning, had apparently been a careful, deliberate lie constructed to keep her hidden from something or someone that had been dangerous enough to require an Alpha King's direct involvement. "Why," she managed finally, "would anyone need to hide me? I was a child. I mixed herbs and swept floors. I have no rank, no title, nothing anyone would consider worth threatening." "Because of who your mother was," Damaris said, "and because of a promise I made her before she died." Elena studied his face, searching for the lie she half expected to find there, some indication that this was an elaborate misunderstanding rather than the truth. But there was nothing but quiet certainty in his expression, the weight of 12 years pressing down on every word he spoke. "What promise?" "That I would keep you safe," he said, "that whatever it cost me, whatever I had to give up, I would make sure her daughter lived long enough to grow into whoever she was meant to become. I built an entire cover for you. I chose the woman who raised you. I made sure the healers in the lower quarter trained you without ever knowing why a stranger from the palace was paying for your education." "You've been watching me," Elena said slowly. "This whole time?" "From a distance," he admitted. "Close enough to make sure nothing happened to you, far enough that no one would ever connect us and put you in danger by association. It worked for 12 years, until an arrow meant for someone else nearly took you from me anyway." Elena's mind was racing faster than her body could process. Every piece of her life she had accepted as ordinary and unremarkable suddenly rearranged itself into something deliberately constructed, hidden in plain sight by a king who had apparently sacrificed years of his own life to keep a promise to a woman he refused to talk about without his voice going rough. "You loved her," Elena said quietly. It was not a question. Something flickered across Damaris's face, quick and unguarded, gone before he could fully hide it. "More than I have ever loved anything else in my life," he said. "And when she died protecting you, I promised myself that loving you the way I loved her would never be part of the arrangement. That I would protect you as a duty, as a debt owed, nothing more. And now?" He did not answer immediately. Instead, he reached out and gently took her hand, the same way he had during her fever, as though the gesture had become something he could not stop himself from doing, even when he clearly wished he could. "Now you whispered a name in your sleep that I have not heard spoken aloud in 12 years, he said, "and I sat beside your bed for 3 days, unable to think about anything except how close I came to losing the last piece of her I had left in this world." Elena did not know how to respond to that. Everything about her life had just been rewritten in the space of a single conversation, and somewhere beneath the shock and confusion, she felt something else stirring, something that had no business existing between a healer's assistant and the king who had secretly shaped every corner of her existence without her ever knowing. Before either of them could say anything further, the chamber door opened again, this time without warning, and a council member Elena, recognized only by sight, an older man named Edgar Holt, stepped inside with an expression that immediately soured the air in the room. "My king," Edgar said, his eyes moving pointedly between Damaris and Elena's joined hands. "The council requests your presence immediately. Cassian Vale has sent a formal message. He knows about the border scouts being spotted, and he is demanding an audience regarding territory rights he claims your father promised his family generations ago." Damaris's expression hardened instantly, the vulnerability of a moment before folding back beneath the armor of leadership. "Tell the council I will be there shortly. They also wish to discuss," Edgar continued, his gaze flicking to Elena, with poorly disguised suspicion, "why you have spent the better part of a week attending to an assistant healer instead of the affairs of this territory." "That is not the council's concern," Damaris said, his voice dropping into something cold enough to make even Edgar take a small step back. "With respect, my king, when a healer's assistant with no family standing becomes the reason you dismiss court healers and abandon council meetings, it becomes everyone's concern." The tension in the room thickened instantly. Elena felt herself shrinking slightly under the weight of Edgar's scrutiny, aware suddenly of exactly how strange this entire situation must look to anyone who did not know the truth hidden inside that leather folder. "I will explain myself to the council when I am ready," Damaris said, "and not a moment before. You may leave." Edgar's mouth tightened, but he offered a stiff bow and retreated from the room, though the look he cast back at Elena before the door closed carried a warning she did not fully understand yet, but suspected she would come to regret ignoring. Once they were alone again, Damaris let out a slow breath, some of the tension leaving his shoulders as he turned back to Elena. "They cannot know the truth yet," he said, "not until I understand exactly what Cassian Vale knows, and why his scouts appeared at our border the same week your identity resurfaced after 12 years of silence." "You think it's connected," Elena said. "I think," Damaris said carefully, "that the people who wanted your mother dead 12 years ago never stopped looking for you, and I think somehow, after all this time, they may have finally found a reason to look again." Elena felt a chill settle over her that had nothing to do with her fading fever. "What happens now?" Damaris rose from the chair, tucking the leather folder beneath his arm once more, though his eyes lingered on her for a long moment before he answered. "Now," he said quietly, "I go pretend to the council that nothing has changed, while I figure out how to protect you from a threat I thought died with your mother 12 years ago. And you rest, and grow strong, because whatever is coming, I am not losing you a second time." He left the room without waiting for her response, and Elena sat alone in the healing chamber, staring at the closed door, trying to absorb the impossible shape her life had suddenly taken. She was not simply an assistant healer who had survived a stray arrow. She was the last living piece of a woman who had died protecting her, hidden for 12 years by a king who had apparently loved that woman enough to reshape his entire existence around keeping her daughter alive. And somewhere beyond the walls of Ashvale territory, an old enemy was stirring again, drawn by the sound of a name that should have stayed buried forever. The council chamber was already tense by the time Damaris arrived, the air thick with the kind of silence that comes before a storm rather than after one. Edgar Holt stood near the head of the long table, arms folded, his expression carefully neutral in a way that told Damaris he had already spent the last hour stirring doubt among the other members. Around the table sat 6 more council representatives, each one holding territory of their own beneath Ashvale's banner, each one watching their king enter the room with a wariness that had not existed a week ago. "You wish to discuss Cassian Vale's message," Damaris said, taking his seat at the head of the table without offering any explanation for his absence. "Among other matters," said a woman named Priscilla Marsh, the eldest member of the council and the one whose opinion carried the most weight among the others. "But yes, let us begin there." A scroll was passed down the table until it reached Damaris. He unrolled it slowly, scanning the elegant, arrogant handwriting he recognized from years of dealing with Cassian Vale's demands. The message claimed old territory rights along the northern border, rights that Cassian insisted had been promised to his family 2 generations ago and never honored. It was the same claim Cassian had made 3 times before, always rejected, always followed by a period of uneasy quiet. But this time, buried in the final line of the message, was something new. "We are also aware that certain matters long considered settled in Ashvale territory may require revisiting, given recent developments involving persons of interest within your court." Damaris read the line twice, his expression giving nothing away, though his pulse had picked up in a way he did not allow to show on his face. "What does that mean?" Priscilla asked, watching him closely. "Persons of interest." "I don't know," Damaris said, which was, in the narrowest possible sense, true. He did not know exactly what Cassian knew. He only knew what he feared. "It seems a strange thing to include in a message about border rights," Edgar said, his eyes flicking meaningfully toward Damaris. "Unless there is something happening within this court that Cassian Vale has somehow become aware of before the rest of us. Speak plainly if you have something to say, Edgar." "Very well," Edgar straightened, clearly having waited for this exact opening. The entire territory is aware that you dismissed 3 senior healers and personally attended to an assistant healer with no family standing for the better part of a week. Now Cassian Vale sends a message referencing persons of interest within our court on the very same week. I am simply asking whether these 2 things might be connected, and if so, whether the council deserves an explanation. The room went quiet, every eye turning toward Damaris. He considered his options carefully. The truth, if revealed too early, could put Elena in more danger than she already faced. But continued silence would only deepen the council's suspicion and give Edgar more room to maneuver against him. The healer in question, Damaris said finally, choosing his words with care, is connected to a matter of territory security from 12 years ago. A matter that predates most of you on this council. I am not prepared to discuss the details until I better understand what Cassian Vale knows and how he came to know it. So you admit there is a connection, Priscilla said. I admit that this territory has secrets older than some of the people sitting at this table, Damaris said, and that some of those secrets are mine to protect, not the council's to interrogate. The tension in the room thickened, but no one pressed further, not with the weight of his tone settling over the chamber like a physical thing. The meeting continued for another hour, covering supply routes and border patrols and the logistics of responding to Cassian's renewed demands, but Damaris found his mind drifting constantly back to the healing chamber, to Elena, to the growing certainty that whatever storm was gathering at Ashvale's borders had her at its center whether she understood that yet or not. He was proven right sooner than he expected. That evening, as Elena sat by the window of the healing chamber, watching the last light fade from the sky, a soft knock came at the door, followed by Colin's voice, hushed and urgent. "Miss Voss, someone's here to see you. Says she's an old friend of your family." Elena frowned, setting down the cup of tea Nora had brought her earlier. She had no family beyond Greta, who had died 2 winters ago, and certainly no friends who would know to find her recovering in the palace's private healing chamber. "Send her away," Elena said carefully. "I'm not receiving visitors." But the door opened anyway, and a woman stepped inside before Colin could stop her, moving with the fluid confidence of someone who belonged in far grander rooms than a modest healing chamber. She was perhaps 40, elegantly dressed in deep green, with sharp eyes that swept over Elena with an assessing coldness that made the hair on the back of Elena's neck rise. "Forgive the intrusion," the woman said smoothly. "My name is Priya Vale. I believe you may have heard my family's name mentioned recently." Elena's blood went cold. Vale. The same name attached to the border scouts, the same name in Cassian's demanding message that had sent Damaris storming out of the healing chamber 3 days ago. "I don't believe we've met," Elena said carefully, reaching for the calm, professional tone she had spent years cultivating as a healer, even as her heart pounded against her ribs. "No," Priya agreed, "we haven't. But your mother and I were once close, many years ago, before certain unfortunate events separated our families." "I don't know what you're talking about." Priya's smile did not waver, but something colder moved behind her eyes. Mira Voss was a remarkable woman. It's a shame she died the way she did, protecting a secret that, as it turns out, was never as well hidden as everyone believed. Elena felt the room tilt slightly. "I think you should leave." "I only came to offer some friendly advice," Priya said, stepping closer despite Elena's clear discomfort. "Whatever the king has told you about your history, whatever promises he has made about protecting you, you should understand that promises made 12 years ago rarely survive the political realities of today. Damaris Thorne has a territory to run, and a council growing more suspicious of him by the day. How long do you think his protection will last once it becomes inconvenient?" "Get out," Elena said, her voice sharper now, though her hands had begun to tremble. Priya studied her for a long moment, as though weighing whether to say more, before finally offering a small, unbothered shrug. "As you wish. But when the time comes that you need somewhere safer than this palace, remember that my family has always been willing to protect the things Ashvale discards. Your mother understood that once, before she made the mistake of trusting the wrong king. She left as smoothly as she had entered, and Elena sat frozen in the aftermath, her heart hammering, her mind racing through everything the woman had said. Colin, who had watched the entire exchange from the doorway with visible alarm, immediately moved to fetch Damaris, leaving Elena alone with her spinning thoughts for what felt like an eternity before the chamber door opened again and Damaris strode in, his expression thunderous. "She was here," he said, "not a question." "Priya Vale," Elena confirmed. "She said she knew my mother. She said something about promises not surviving political realities, and that her family would protect what Ashvale discards." Damaris's jaw tightened to the point of visible strain. "She should not have been able to reach you. I will have every guard on this corridor reassigned by morning." Damaris. Elena rarely used his name without title, and the sound of it seemed to catch him off guard, some of the fury draining from his expression as he looked at her properly for the first time since entering the room. "What aren't you telling me?" He was quiet for a long moment, clearly weighing how much more truth she could absorb in a single day. Finally, he sat down heavily in the chair beside her cot, rubbing a hand across his face in a gesture that made him look, for just a moment, less like a king and more like an exhausted man carrying far too much alone. 12 years ago, he said, your mother discovered something about the Vale family that they could not afford to have exposed. Evidence that Cassian's father had been secretly poisoning border wells to weaken rival territories before annexing them, using methods disguised to look like natural contamination. She brought that evidence to me. I acted on it, quietly, cutting off Vale influence in 3 border territories before they could expand further. And they blamed her. They discovered her involvement within a year, Damaris said. By then I had already married, for reasons of alliance rather than affection, and Mira and I had already ended things between us, though not because either of us wanted to. The Vale family found her alone, unprotected by any official connection to the crown, and made certain she would never expose them again. They killed her. Yes. The word came out rough, worn down by years of carrying it silently. And when I learned they intended to finish what they started, by eliminating you as well, since you were old enough by then to have overheard things a child should never have overheard, I made the decision to erase your identity entirely. New name, new guardian, a childhood built specifically to keep you invisible to anyone looking for Mira Voss's daughter. Elena absorbed this in silence, pieces of her fractured childhood memories finally settling into a shape that made painful sense. The forest. The running. The voice telling her to stay quiet. It had not been a nightmare born of fever. It had been a real memory, buried so deeply that only near death had been enough to shake it loose. And now Priya Vale knows, Elena said quietly, which means Cassian knows. Which means, Damaris said, his voice hardening with resolve, that they intend to finish what they started 12 years ago, and I am not going to allow that to happen a second time. How can you be certain you can stop them? You said yourself the council is already growing suspicious. If Cassian moves publicly, if he brings evidence about my mother before the entire council, you could lose everything trying to protect someone with no rank, no title, and no claim to anyone's loyalty but yours. Then I will lose everything, Damaris said simply, without hesitation, as though the calculation had already been made long ago and required no further consideration. I made a promise to your mother that I have kept for 12 years at the cost of my own peace, and I am not going to break it now because the cost has become inconvenient. Elena felt something shift in her chest, something warm and terrifying in equal measure, as she looked at the man who had apparently sacrificed more than she could fully understand to keep a promise made to a woman he had loved and lost, all in service of protecting a child he had never been permitted to know. "Why?" she asked quietly. "Did you never tell me any of this before? Why let me grow up believing I had no one?" "Because the safest lie was the one you never had to maintain yourself," he said. "A child who does not know she is hiding cannot accidentally reveal it. I watched you grow up from a distance, Elena. I watched you become a healer, skilled and steady and kind in exactly the way your mother was, and every single day I wanted to tell you the truth, and every single day I understood that telling you would only put you in more danger. The two of them sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of 12 years of careful, painful distance settling between them like something almost tangible. Outside the chamber window, the last light had fully faded, leaving the room lit only by a single lamp, its glow soft and warm against the growing darkness of everything they now understood was coming. "What happens now?" Elena asked finally. "Now?" Damaris said, standing and moving toward the window, staring out at the darkened grounds of the palace, as though searching for threats hidden among the shadows. "I prepare this territory for a fight I hoped I would never have to face again. And I make certain that whatever Cassian Vale intends to do with what he knows, he understands that touching you will cost him everything he has." Elena watched him standing there, silhouetted against the window, carrying the weight of a promise that had shaped both of their lives without her ever knowing it existed. Whatever fear she felt at the danger now circling closer, it was matched, strangely, by something steadier taking root beneath it, a sense that whatever came next, she would not be facing it as an orphan with no family and no protection. She would be facing it as the daughter of a woman brave enough to die protecting a secret, standing beside a king who had spent 12 years proving that some promises are worth keeping no matter the cost. 3 days later, that promise would be tested in ways neither of them could have prepared for. The attack came at midday, when the palace was busiest, when no one expected danger to walk through the front gate dressed as a delivery cart driver. Elena had finally been permitted to leave the healing chamber that morning, under strict guard, to walk the palace gardens for the first time in nearly 2 weeks. The physical exercise felt good after so many days confined to a single room, and for a brief, fragile moment, she allowed herself to forget the weight of everything Damaris had told her. She focused instead on the smell of the flowering vines along the garden wall, the warmth of sunlight on her face, the simple pleasure of moving her own legs across solid ground. The cart rolled through the service entrance without incident, its driver waving casually to the gate guards, his face unremarkable, his manner unhurried. No one questioned him. Delivery carts arrived at the palace daily, carrying grain and cloth and supplies for the kitchens. It was Owen, one of the younger guards assigned to Elena's protection detail, who noticed something wrong first. The cart's wheels sat too low for its supposed cargo, as though weighted down by something far heavier than sacks of grain. "Stop that cart," Owen called out, but the warning came half a second too late. The driver moved fast, faster than any ordinary tradesman should have been able to move, throwing back the canvas covering to reveal 2 more men crouched beneath it, weapons already drawn. Screams erupted across the garden as palace staff scattered. Owen shouted Elena's name, lunging toward her even as the first attacker broke into a full sprint across the courtyard, angling directly toward where she stood frozen beside the flowering vines. Everything happened in fragments after that. Elena remembered Owen's body slamming into her side, knocking her out of the attacker's path and into the hard dirt of the garden path. She remembered the sharp crack of something striking Owen instead of her, remembered his grunt of pain, remembered scrambling backward across the ground as chaos erupted around them. She remembered, most clearly of all, the sound of Damaris's voice, raw and furious, cutting across the courtyard like a blade. He had been in a meeting with the council when the alarm bells rang, and he crossed the distance between the meeting hall and the garden faster than seemed physically possible, arriving in time to see the second attacker closing in on Elena while she struggled to pull herself upright. What happened next, Elena only pieced together afterward from the accounts of guards who witnessed it. Damaris moved through the remaining attackers with a brutal efficiency that left no question about why he held the title of Alpha King, disarming one man and driving the second back with a series of movements too fast for Elena's shocked mind to fully track. Within moments, the immediate threat had been neutralized, the attackers subdued or fled, the garden falling into a stunned, ringing silence, broken only by Owen's pained breathing and the distant shouts of guards securing the perimeter. Damaris reached Elena within seconds, dropping to his knees beside her, his hands moving over her with frantic urgency, checking for wounds even as she tried to tell him she was unharmed. "I'm fine," she managed, her voice shaking despite her best efforts to steady it. "Owen. Help Owen. He took the hit meant for me." Damaris's attention snapped immediately to the young guard, who had collapsed a few feet away, blood already soaking through his tunic from a wound along his ribs. Healers arrived within minutes, summoned by the alarm bells, and Elena found herself pushed gently but firmly aside as they worked to stabilize Owen's injury. It was only once Owen had been carried away for proper treatment, once the garden had been cleared of the remaining chaos, that Damaris finally turned his full attention back to Elena, and the fury she saw building behind his eyes was unlike anything she had witnessed from him before. "They came for you in broad daylight," he said, his voice dangerously quiet, "inside my own palace walls." "I'm alive," Elena said. "That's what matters." "That is not what matters," Damaris said, standing abruptly and pacing the length of the garden path, his hands clenched at his sides. "What matters is that Cassian Vale grew bold enough to send men into my own territory to finish what his father started 12 years ago, and he did it while I sat in a council meeting arguing about grain quotas instead of protecting the one person I promised to keep safe." "You couldn't have known." "I should have known," he said sharply, then seemed to catch himself, drawing a slow breath before continuing in a calmer, though still tightly controlled voice. "I should have doubled your guard the moment Priya Vale walked into that healing chamber. I let my confidence in this palace's security outweigh my understanding of exactly how far the Vale family is willing to go." Elena pushed herself to her feet, brushing dirt from her clothing, her hands still trembling slightly from the shock of the attack. "What happens to the men who attacked me?" "They will be questioned," Damaris said, "and I intend to learn exactly how much Cassian Vale knows, and exactly what he intends to do next, before the sun sets tonight." The interrogation that followed took place in a lower level of the palace rarely visited by anyone outside the guard and council, and Elena was not permitted to witness it directly, though she waited in an adjoining chamber, unable to focus on anything except the muffled sound of voices beyond the heavy door. When Damaris finally emerged, hours later, his expression carried a grim certainty that told Elena the news was not good. "They confirmed Cassian sent them," he said without preamble. "He knows everything, your true parentage, your mother's role in exposing his family 12 years ago, all of it. Priya Vale's visit to your chamber was not a friendly warning. It was a test, to confirm your identity beyond any doubt before Cassian committed to acting. And now that he's confirmed it, now he intends to force the issue publicly," Damaris said. "One of the men we questioned mentioned a formal announcement Cassian plans to make before the full council within days, revealing your identity and accusing me of harboring the daughter of a woman who, according to the story he intends to tell, murdered his father through poisoned evidence rather than exposed a genuine crime." Elena felt her stomach drop. "He's going to twist the truth." "He's going to try," Damaris said, "and depending on how convincingly he presents it, he may succeed in turning enough of the council against me to weaken my position significantly, perhaps even enough to justify military action along our shared border under the guise of correcting a historical injustice." "This is my fault," Elena said quietly. "If I had never woken from that fever, if I had never said that name." "Do not," Damaris said, crossing the room in 2 quick strides and taking her by the shoulders, his eyes fierce with an intensity that stole the rest of her sentence away. "Do not for one moment believe that any part of this is your fault. You are the daughter of a woman who died exposing a genuine crime. You have done nothing except survive an attack that should never have been able to reach you inside my own walls. Whatever comes next, whatever Cassian Vale intends to twist into a weapon against us, the fault lies with him and with a debt his family has owed since before you were born." Elena searched his face, finding nothing but fierce, unwavering conviction there, and something in her chest loosened slightly, despite the fear still coursing through her. "What do we do?" she asked. "We do not wait for Cassian to control the narrative," Damaris said, releasing her shoulders but not stepping back, his presence still close, still steadying in a way she had not expected to find comfort in so quickly. I will bring the truth to the council myself, before he has the chance to twist it. I will present the original evidence your mother gathered, evidence I have kept sealed for 12 years, precisely because I hoped I would never need to use it again. Is it enough to convince them? It should be, Damaris said, though something in his tone suggested he was less certain than his words implied. But convincing the council is only half the battle. If Cassian is bold enough to send assassins into my palace, he is bold enough to escalate further once his plan to expose you publicly fails. We should prepare for the possibility that this ends not in a council chamber, but on a battlefield. The words settled heavily over both of them, the reality of what was coming finally taking full shape. This was no longer a quiet matter of hidden identities and old secrets. It had become something far larger, something that threatened to draw the entire territory into conflict, all because a healer's assistant had survived an arrow that was never meant for her, and whispered a name in her sleep that had been buried for 12 years. That evening, as guards doubled their patrols throughout the palace, and messengers were dispatched to allied territories requesting support in the event of open conflict, Elena sat alone in the healing chamber that had become, in the span of 2 short weeks, something closer to a second home than the modest rooms she had grown up in. She thought of her mother, a woman she barely remembered except in fragments of fever dreams, who had chosen to expose a terrible crime, knowing full well the danger it would bring upon herself and her child. She thought of Damaris, a king who had spent 12 years quietly rebuilding his entire existence around a promise made to a dying woman, sacrificing his own peace, his own comfort, perhaps even his own chance at happiness, to keep that promise unbroken. And she thought, with a clarity that surprised her given everything happening around them, that whatever came next, whatever the council decided, whatever Cassian Vale intended to unleash upon Ashvale territory, she no longer felt like someone hiding from her own history. She felt, for the first time in her life, like someone standing squarely inside it, ready to fight for the truth her mother had died protecting. When Damaris entered the chamber later that night, finding her still awake, staring out at the darkened grounds where an assassin's cart had rolled through the gates only hours before, he said nothing at first, simply crossing the room and settling into the chair beside her that had become, in some unspoken way, entirely his. "You should rest," he said eventually. "So should you," Elena replied. "You've barely slept since I woke up from that fever." A faint, tired smile touched his mouth. "Old habits. I spent 12 years unable to fully rest, always wondering if today would be the day someone finally found you. Now that the waiting is over, I find I don't quite know how to stop." "Then don't stop," Elena said quietly. "Stay." He looked at her for a long moment, something unspoken passing between them that neither of them was quite ready to name aloud, before he settled more fully into the chair, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him, close enough that the fear of the day's attack finally began to loosen its grip on her chest. Outside the palace walls, somewhere beyond the northern border, Cassian Vale was already preparing the opening move of a plan 12 years in the making. But inside the healing chamber, for one quiet, fragile moment, there was only the steady presence of 2 people, bound together by a promise neither of them had chosen, but both of them now intended to honor, whatever the cost. The council chamber had never held this many people at once, not in Elena's lifetime. Word had spread through Ashvale territory that the Alpha King intended to make a formal announcement regarding matters of the highest importance, and every representative, every ranking officer, every noble family with a claim to influence had gathered within the stone walls to witness whatever was about to unfold. Elena stood at the edge of the chamber, dressed not in her healer's coat, but in a formal gown Damaris had insisted she wear, deep blue fabric that felt foreign and stiff against skin more accustomed to simple work clothes. Nora stood beside her, offering quiet, steadying words, while Colin and Owen, the young guard now recovered enough to stand watch again, flanked her on either side. Cassian Vale had arrived that morning with a small delegation, requesting the audience he had threatened in his message weeks before, and the council, unaware of the deeper history unfolding beneath the surface of this meeting, had granted it eagerly, hungry for resolution to the growing tension along the northern border. Damaris entered the chamber last, moving to the head of the long table, with the composed authority Elena had first witnessed weeks ago beside her fever bed, though now she understood the depth of everything hidden beneath that composure. "You requested this audience to discuss territory rights," Damaris said, addressing Cassian directly, his voice carrying easily across the silent chamber. "I understand you also intended to discuss other matters." Cassian Vale smiled, a thin, satisfied expression that made Elena's skin crawl even from across the room. He was younger than she expected, perhaps only a few years older than Damaris, with sharp features and a calculated confidence that suggested he had rehearsed this moment many times. "Indeed," Cassian said, "it has come to my attention that this court harbors a secret, 12 years in the making, a secret involving a woman named Mira Voss, who my father always maintained was falsely accused of crimes she did not commit, crimes fabricated to justify stripping my family of territories rightfully ours." Murmurs rippled through the assembled council. Priscilla Marsh leaned forward slightly, her sharp eyes moving between Cassian and Damaris with growing interest. "And it has further come to my attention," Cassian continued, his gaze sweeping toward Elena for the first time, drawing every eye in the chamber toward her along with it, that Mira Voss's daughter survived, hidden all these years within this very territory, under the protection of a king who has personally attended to her recovery from a recent injury with an attention that goes far beyond simple duty. Edgar Holt, seated near the front of the assembly, nodded slowly, his expression grimly satisfied, as though everything he had suspected weeks ago was finally being confirmed in front of the entire council. "I present this not as accusation," Cassian said smoothly, "but as a request for justice long overdue. My family was falsely stripped of border territories based on fabricated evidence 12 years ago. The woman responsible died before facing any accountability for her lies. I ask this council to consider restoring what was wrongfully taken, and to consider whether a king who conceals such secrets from his own council can be trusted to rule with the transparency this territory deserves." The chamber erupted into overlapping voices, council members turning to one another in shock and confusion. Damaris allowed the noise to continue for only a moment before raising a single hand, and the room settled into silence with the kind of instant obedience that came only from years of respected authority. "Cassian Vale tells a story," Damaris said, "built on a foundation of lies his father constructed to hide a genuine crime. I will not ask this council to simply take my word over his. I will show you the truth instead." He produced the leather folder Elena had seen weeks ago in the healing chamber, along with several additional documents she had not previously known existed, and passed them down the table for the council to examine. Sealed testimonies from healers who had treated the poisoned wells firsthand, detailed records of contamination patterns that matched no natural source, a confession, obtained years after the fact from a former Vale servant who had since sought asylum in a distant territory, describing in detail the deliberate poisoning ordered by Cassian's father to weaken rival lands before annexing them. "Mira Voss did not fabricate evidence," Damaris said, as the documents made their way around the table, murmurs of shock and dawning understanding rippling through the council as they read. "She uncovered a genuine atrocity and paid for that discovery with her life, murdered by agents of the Vale family for daring to expose what they had done." Cassian's composed expression finally cracked, fury flashing across his face. "These documents are forgeries." "They are not," Damaris said calmly, "and I would remind the council that the same family now accusing me of deception sent armed men into my palace grounds only days ago in an attempt to murder Mira Voss's daughter before she could ever speak the truth publicly." Gasps echoed through the chamber. Priscilla Marsh's expression had shifted entirely, sharp suspicion now aimed squarely at Cassian rather than at Damaris. "Is this true?" she asked, her voice cutting through the noise. "Did your family send assassins into Ashvale territory?" "Lies," Cassian snapped, though the confidence that had carried him into the chamber was rapidly crumbling. Fabrications meant to distract from the true injustice done to my family. We captured 3 of your men alive, Damaris said. Each of them confirmed under separate questioning that they acted on your direct orders. I did not bring this matter before the council to seek sympathy for myself. I brought it to ensure that the daughter of a woman who died protecting this territory from genuine harm is never again forced to hide who she truly is. Every eye in the chamber turned toward Elena. She felt the weight of their collective gaze pressing down on her. 12 years of hidden history suddenly laid bare before the very people who had unknowingly walked past her in the marketplace, trained beside her in the healing quarters, never once suspecting the truth of who she really was. She stepped forward, her heart pounding, though her voice, when she finally found it, came out steadier than she expected. "My mother died protecting the truth," Elena said, addressing the council directly. "I did not know any of this until 2 weeks ago. I did not ask to be hidden, and I did not ask for the protection that has been given to me at great personal cost. But I will not stand silently while a man twists my mother's sacrifice into a lie meant to justify his own family's crimes." Cassian's expression twisted with barely restrained fury, but before he could respond, Priscilla Marsh rose from her seat, her voice carrying the full authority of her years on the council. "The evidence presented today is compelling," she said, "and the attempted assassination of an innocent woman within Ashvale's own palace walls is a crime this council cannot ignore, regardless of the border dispute that brought us here. I move that we formally reject Cassian Vale's territorial claims and open a full investigation into the actions of his family, both 12 years ago and in recent days." The motion carried swiftly, council members who had wavered under Edgar's earlier suspicions now firmly aligning against Cassian, as the weight of evidence made further denial impossible. Cassian, recognizing the tide had turned irreversibly against him, gathered his delegation and departed the chamber in tense, humiliated silence, though the look he cast back toward Elena before leaving carried a promise of resentment that would not simply disappear because a council vote had gone against him. Once the chamber had cleared, once the council members had dispersed to discuss the implications of everything they had just witnessed, Elena finally allowed herself to exhale a breath she felt she had been holding for the better part of an hour. Damaris crossed the room to stand beside her, his expression softening now that the immediate danger had passed, though the exhaustion of the confrontation still showed clearly in the tightness around his eyes. "You did well," he said quietly. "I nearly forgot how to breathe standing in front of that entire council," Elena admitted. "You did not show it," he said. "Your mother would have been proud." Elena felt something warm bloom in her chest at those words. 12 years of unanswered questions finally beginning to settle into something resembling peace. What happens now, with Cassian, with the territory, with everything? "The investigation will take time," Damaris said. "But the council has seen the truth clearly enough that I believe Ashvale's position is secure, at least for now. Cassian may nurse his grievances privately, but he no longer has the standing to act against us openly without exposing himself to further consequence." "And what happens to me?" Damaris turned to face her fully, something in his expression shifting into a quiet, careful vulnerability that reminded her powerfully of the moment, weeks ago, when she had first whispered her mother's chosen name for her in her fever sleep. "That," he said, "depends entirely on what you want. You are no longer hidden, Elena. You no longer need to live in the shadows of a life built to keep you safe from a danger that has finally been brought into the light. Whatever you choose to become now, healer, council advisor, anything at all, that choice belongs entirely to you. And if what I choose," Elena said slowly, testing the words as they left her mouth, "is to stay close to the man who spent 12 years keeping a promise he never had to explain to anyone but himself." Something in Damaris's expression broke open entirely, 12 years of careful restraint finally giving way to something unguarded and honest. "Then I would consider myself the most fortunate king this territory has ever known." Weeks later, once the investigation into the Vale family's crimes had concluded, and the northern border had settled into an uneasy but stable peace. Elena stood once more in the palace gardens, where the assassin's cart had rolled through the gates only a short time before. The flowering vines had grown fuller in the intervening weeks, and the garden path, once stained with the memory of violence, now felt simply like a quiet place to walk in the afternoon sun. Damaris found her there, as he often did now, no longer hiding the ease with which he sought out her company, no longer pretending that 12 years of quiet devotion had been merely duty, rather than something far deeper he had spent over a decade refusing to name. "The council has requested a formal announcement," he said, settling beside her on the garden bench. "They want to know the nature of our relationship, given how much has already been revealed." "And what will you tell them?" He reached for her hand, the same gesture that had once accompanied her through a fever no healer could explain, though now it carried none of the desperate fear that had marked it then, only steady certainty. "I will tell them the truth," he said, "that Mira Voss's daughter is the reason I have done everything I have done for the last 12 years, and that I intend to spend whatever years remain to me making certain she never has cause to whisper my name in fear again." Elena smiled, leaning into him as the afternoon light settled warmly across the garden, the last shadow of 12 years of hidden danger finally fading into something that felt, for the first time in her life, entirely safe. She had spent her whole life believing herself an orphan, with no family and no history worth remembering. She understood now that she had never truly been alone at all, protected in silence by a king who had loved her mother enough to guard her daughter from a distance for 12 long years, and who now, with the danger finally behind them, was no longer willing to love her from anywhere but her side.